I choose her. The Mafia boss said it like it cost him nothing. But for the woman standing in that room, the one they'd been laughing at for 20 minutes straight, those three words rewrote everything. One of the candidates, a blonde woman in a tailored white blazer, had just whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear. Did she seriously think she belonged here? She should have applied at a cafeteria. The laughter that followed wasn't quiet. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of laughter designed to break a person down to the bone and leave them too humiliated to fight back. Imani Whitaker didn't flinch, but her hand, the one gripping that worn notebook, tightened until her knuckles ached. Ask yourself, if that were you, standing in a room full of strangers who'd already decided you'd lost before you'd even begun, what would you do? If this kind of story moves you, subscribe right now and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will absolutely shake you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The snow started falling around 6 in the morning, the kind that didn't ask permission. It came down thick and quiet over Brooklyn, the sort of snow that muffled everything: traffic, voices, the particular sound a suitcase makes when its wheels catch on a cracked sidewalk. Imani noticed that sound. She'd noticed it every time she'd dragged that suitcase somewhere new in the last 2 years, and the sound had never once gotten easier to hear. She stood on the front stoop of her aunt's building for a moment before descending, not because she was sentimental about leaving, but because the cold hit her face so hard it took a second to breathe through it. The suitcase wasn't large. That was the humiliating part. That 31 years of a life could compress into something you could lift with one arm if you really had to. She didn't look back up at the window. She already knew Aunt Rochelle wasn't there. Rochelle had said what she needed to say the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. I'm not putting you out, baby. I'm just saying the room is spoken for starting February. You knew this was temporary. Imani had nodded. She'd said, I know. Thank you for everything. And she'd meant both things, even though one of them hurt more than the other. She walked to the subway with her shoulders squared, which was a habit she'd developed sometime around the 3rd month after the bakery collapsed, when she realized that if she let them curve, they might never straighten again. The bakery. Even 2 years out, that word still landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The honey table. That was what she'd called it. 42 seats, a mint green awning, and a chalkboard menu she'd updated by hand every single morning. She'd opened it at 27 with a business partner named Curtis Webb, who had a gift for financials and a handshake that made investors feel like they were already friends. Between the two of them, they built something real. Weekend lines out the door, a catering contract with a local events company, a small but loyal staff of 7 people who showed up on time and called the place home. What Curtis had also built, quietly and over the course of 14 months, was a web of forged signatures, falsified loan documents, and redirected business funds that eventually swallowed the honey table whole. By the time Imani understood what had happened, Curtis was gone. The accounts were empty. The loans were in her name. The suppliers were calling daily. 3 of her employees, people she'd trained, people whose kids' names she knew, had stopped answering the phone because they were embarrassed for her, which somehow hurt more than the ones who were simply angry. Her family's response had been quiet and devastating in the way only family can manage. No one called her a fool directly. They didn't have to. She felt it in the pauses when she walked into rooms, in the way her mother said, "Well, what's the plan now?" The same afternoon, the bankruptcy paperwork was filed. There was no plan. That was the honest answer. For the first time in her adult life, Imani Whitaker did not have a plan, and the absence of one felt like standing on ice that was already cracking. She'd spent the next 2 years doing the work of staying alive. Reception jobs, a stint managing inventory at a distribution warehouse, freelance scheduling work for 3 different small businesses, none of which could afford her full-time. She was good at all of it. She was good at almost everything except convincing people to take her seriously before she'd already proven herself. And the older she got, the more exhausting that particular performance became. The ad for Valenti Global's executive assistant position had appeared on a job board at 11:30 at night while she was sitting on Rochelle's pull-out sofa eating crackers because she hadn't wanted to use the last of her groceries on a real meal. The listing was sparse: corporate tone, general duties, competitive salary listed as commensurate with experience. The address was a building on Lexington Avenue she'd walked past 100 times without looking up. She almost didn't apply. She almost closed the tab. What stopped her was a sentence near the bottom of the listing, almost an afterthought. This position requires the ability to function effectively under pressure with limited resources. She stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she submitted her application. The morning of the interview, she ironed her navy suit in Rochelle's bathroom at 5 a.m. with the door closed so the steam wouldn't wake anyone. The suit was 3 years old and had a small repair along the left hip where she'd caught the fabric on a filing cabinet drawer and sewn it back herself. She'd done the repair so carefully that you could only see it if you were looking for it, and she'd told herself that was good enough. It wasn't the same as not having the tear, but it was good enough. The Valenti Global building was black glass from street to crown, the kind of architecture that didn't want to be friendly. Imani arrived 20 minutes early, which meant she was among the first dozen candidates to check in, and she had time to look at the room before the rest of them filled it. They came in well-dressed and confident and carrying the quiet certainty of people who believed rooms like this were built for them. Designer bags, watches that caught the light in a specific way, degrees from schools whose names worked as their own introductions. Imani clocked them the way she used to clock a busy Saturday morning rush, quickly, accurately, without judgment. She was simply cataloging the landscape. She found a seat near the center of the room and opened her notebook. Not to review anything in particular, but because having something in her hands kept her from sitting on them, which was what she did when she was nervous and trying not to show it. The woman who sat down beside her didn't introduce herself. She simply looked at Imani's notebook, the actual paper kind, spiral-bound, with color-coded tabs and handwritten systems along the margins, and then looked at Imani and then back at the notebook with the particular expression of someone who has found something unexpectedly funny. "You actually wrote everything by hand," the woman said. Her name tag read Cassandra. She had the posture of someone who had been told she was beautiful so often that it had become structural. "I did," Imani said. "That's adorable." Cassandra's tone made clear she meant the opposite. Imani didn't answer. She turned a page. 30 minutes into the waiting period, someone near the windows said something Imani didn't quite catch. But she heard the laughter that followed it, and she heard the specific word kitchen land in the middle of a sentence, and she understood exactly what had been said even without the surrounding context. She kept her face still. This was another habit she'd developed in the last 2 years. The ability to go still in a way that looked like calm, but was really a kind of controlled distance. A stepping back inside herself to a place where other people's cruelty couldn't quite reach. She wasn't numb. She felt everything. She was simply practiced at not letting the feeling show in the 3 seconds after impact. What she didn't expect was what happened next. The company's scheduling system went down at 10:47. She knew the exact time because she was looking at her notebook when the room changed energy. Not loudly, but with that specific shift that happens when people who are accustomed to having things go right suddenly find that something has gone very wrong. A junior administrator named Petra appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who has just been handed a problem that is technically above her pay grade. She explained, in brief and increasingly anxious terms, that the digital calendar managing the day's executive arrivals had crashed. Not frozen, crashed, gone. International delegations, legal teams, Port Authority representatives, political liaisons from 2 different offices, all of them were converging on the building in the next 4 hours, and none of the scheduling information was accessible. The room erupted immediately, in the way rooms full of highly educated, highly competitive people erupt when the thing they expected to be in control of suddenly isn't. "You need to get your IT department. This is completely unacceptable. Where's the backup? I have a law firm arriving at noon, and if they're not properly received..." Cassandra stood up and demanded to speak with someone senior. Another candidate was on his phone, calling someone he presumably knew. 2 others were arguing about whose responsibility the situation was, while Petra's face slowly rearranged itself into the expression of a person who is sincerely wondering whether they should simply leave the building. Imani was already writing. She'd heard the names. She'd heard the times. Petra had mentioned them in her explanation, thrown them out in a cascade of anxiety, not knowing that someone in the room was actually listening. Imani had the times, the rough sequence, the organizations involved. She had the printed confirmation email she'd pulled for herself before arriving, which included the building's entry protocols and the security check-in procedures she'd researched the night before because she'd wanted to be prepared for anything. She approached Petra quietly, notebook in hand, and said, "I can rebuild the schedule if you can give me the confirmed arrival windows." Petra stared at her. "What?" "The times. Just tell me the arrival windows for each party. I'll organize it." Petra, who was drowning and knew it, told her. In 12 minutes, Imani counted, because she always counted, because counting kept her focused when everything else was loud. She had a functional schedule laid out across 2 notebook pages. Not a digital calendar, not a synchronized system, a handwritten framework with time blocks, priority flags, security clearance notes, and contingency buffers for overlapping arrivals. She'd accounted for the legal team's separate entry requirement, noted the Port Authority delegation's interpreter, need based on a name she recognized from the confirmation email's carbon copy, and flagged a potential conflict between 2 competing investors who, based on the information she had, should not be received in the same lobby at the same time. She handed it to Petra. Petra read it again. Then she left the room quickly and came back 4 minutes later looking like someone had just handed her a lifeline she hadn't known to ask for. Imani sat back down. She turned to a new page in her notebook. Around her, the room was still loud, still self-important, still performing competence at high volume while solving precisely nothing. She didn't notice the man in the corner of the room until the room went quiet. I was standing near the far wall, which was how she'd missed him, not in the center of the space where people who owned rooms tended to position themselves, but off to the side, where the angle allowed him to see everything without being the first thing anyone looked at. He was wearing a dark suit without a tie, which was somehow more formal than every expensive tie in the room. He was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not warm, not cold either, simply very, very attentive. The room had gone quiet because he'd moved. He'd pushed off the wall and walked across the floor, and the sound of his footsteps had done what usually took someone 5 minutes of talking to accomplish. Every candidate turned to watch him without knowing why, which was the specific quality of a man who had spent years in rooms where being watched was not a choice anyone got to make. He walked past Cassandra, past the man with the expensive watch, past the candidate who was still holding his phone like it was going to save him. He stopped in front of Imani. She looked up. "I choose her," he said. He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. He said it to the room the way you'd state the temperature outside. A fact, offered without negotiation. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Imani felt it settle over the room like something physical. She felt, too, the particular quality of 300 people's attention swinging toward her simultaneously, and the way some of that attention was disbelief and some of it was outrage. And a small, almost imperceptible fraction of it was something that might, if she were being generous, be called recognition. She stood up slowly. She closed her notebook. She met his eyes for exactly as long as it took to understand that this was real, and that she was not going to drop her gaze first. "Okay," she said. That was all. Just okay. But her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Something that wasn't quite excitement, and wasn't quite fear, but lived in the narrow space between them, where the most important moments of a person's life tend to happen. She didn't let it reach her face. She was practiced at that now. What she couldn't practice away was the small, stubborn warmth that spread through her when she realized, for the first time in 2 years, that someone had looked directly at her and decided she was exactly enough. She followed Dante Valenti out of the room. Behind her, the silence broke. But Imani didn't hear what filled it. She was already walking forward, notebook in hand, into whatever came next. The office they put her in was not an office. It was a converted storage room on the 14th floor, with a desk that wobbled on one leg, a phone that had 3 deadlines out of 5, and a window that faced the interior shaft of the building, which meant the only thing she could see from her chair was the gray concrete wall of the adjacent floor, and, if she leaned at exactly the right angle, a sliver of clouded sky the size of a paperback novel. There was no nameplate on the door. There was no chair for visitors. There was a filing cabinet with a broken lock that someone had shoved against the wall at an angle that suggested they'd stopped caring about it around the same time they'd stopped caring about the room itself. Imani stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Then she walked in, set her bag on the desk, pressed one hand flat against the wobbling surface to test exactly how bad the imbalance was, and pulled her notebook from her bag. She was going to need a bigger notebook. The first test came before lunch on the first day. A man named Jeffrey Hale arrived at her door at 11:15 with the energy of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He was the director of external affairs, somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver hair that he wore like a credential and the kind of suit that communicated, in very precise and deliberate terms, that he had been in this building longer than she had been alive in the professional sense of the word. He dropped a stack of folders on her desk without asking. The stack was not small. Dante asked for a complete overview of the Marseille account before Thursday, he said. All supplementary documentation needs cross-referenced and tabbed. Imani looked at the stack, then at Jeffrey. Thursday is in 36 hours. I'm aware of when Thursday is. How long has this been sitting in your department? Jeffrey's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side of it presses their weight against it. That's not relevant. It's 3 weeks of documentation, Mr. Hale. The date stamps are visible from here. Your job, Jeffrey said, with a precision that was colder than volume, is to complete the task, not audit how it arrived at your desk. He left without closing the door. Imani looked at the stack for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up the top folder, opened it, and started reading. She worked through lunch. She worked through the afternoon. At 5:30, when the 14th floor had gone mostly quiet, she was still at her desk with 3 separate sets of color-coded flags deployed across the documentation and a cross-reference chart she'd built by hand on the back of an unused personnel form she'd found in the broken filing cabinet. At 6:15, a woman appeared in her doorway. She was younger than Imani expected, maybe 24, with an expression that combined exhaustion and wariness in a ratio that suggested she'd been carrying both for a long time. She had a laptop bag over one shoulder and a takeout coffee in each hand, and she held one of them out toward Imani the way you'd extend an offering when you weren't sure how it was going to be received. I'm Elias's desk neighbor, she said. He told me to bring this up. He said you looked like you were going to be here late. Imani took the coffee. Who's Elias? Junior assistant, second floor. He was in the lobby when everything crashed this morning. The woman paused. He said you fixed it. I reorganized it. That's what fixing looks like around here. She glanced at the documentation spread across Imani's desk. Is that the Marseille account? You know it? I know that 3 different people have tried to organize that file over the past 2 months, and Hale kept sending it back. She looked at the cross-reference chart. Her eyes moved across it quickly, the way someone's eyes move when they're actually reading and not just looking. Is that a relational index? It's a structure that lets you find any document in under 45 seconds without knowing the filing system, which, by the way, doesn't have a coherent filing system. The woman was quiet for a moment. I'm Priya, she said finally. Corporate communications, 3rd floor. Unofficially, I pay attention to things. Imani. I know. Priya's voice was careful. Everybody knows. That's not a good thing yet. Imani looked at her. What does that mean? Priya glanced at the doorway, which was still open, and then back. It means Hale told 4 department heads this morning that Dante's new hire was going to last 2 weeks, that the Marseille assignment was designed to be too much for someone without institutional knowledge to complete on time. The coffee was hot in Imani's hand. She set it down on the desk. He told you that? He told the heads. I was in the room delivering a report. People in my position become invisible in certain kinds of conversations. Something in Priya's tone said this had been both useful and tiring for a very long time. I thought you should know what you're actually walking into. After Priya left, Imani sat with her hands flat on the desk and breathed through her nose for a moment. The building had that specific after-hours silence, the hum of ventilation, the distant sound of a cleaning cart somewhere on the floor above, the weight of thousands of square feet going still around her. She thought about the bakery, about the way Curtis had smiled across the table at their first investors' meeting, easy and warm and completely convincing, about how long it had taken her to understand that a person could look directly at you and be thinking something entirely different. She picked up her pen and kept working. The Marseille documentation was on Dante's desk by 8:15 Wednesday morning, fully cross-referenced, tabbed, and accompanied by a one-page summary she'd written in plain language that stripped out the legal scaffolding and told him exactly what the account contained, what was missing, and what needed a decision before the Friday deadline. She knew he'd received it because Petra, who had apparently decided that Imani was worth communicating with, sent a two-word message to the internal system. He read it. That was all. But Imani exhaled for the first time in 36 hours and ate the banana she'd bought from a street cart that morning and hadn't touched since. The second test was less professional and more personal, and for that reason, considerably harder to absorb without flinching. She was in the elevator on Thursday afternoon when 3 women got on at the 8th floor. 2 she didn't know, and 1 she recognized as Andrea Voss, Director of Client Relations, whose name she'd seen on the organizational chart, and whose reputation Priya had summarized in 5 words: smart, strategic, and doesn't share. Andrea didn't look at Imani directly. She looked at the elevator doors and spoke to the woman beside her at a volume that was precisely calibrated. Loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to be deniable. "I heard he picked her because she reminds him of his grandmother," Andrea said. Her companion laughed, a small, polished sound. "I can't imagine any other explanation." The elevator was quiet for exactly 1 floor. Imani stared at the doors. She counted the seconds between floors the way she used to count the minutes on a slow Tuesday morning at the bakery, when the hours could feel heavy if she let them, and letting them was not something she could afford. She got off at the 14th floor without having said a word. She stood in the hallway outside her door and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment. Not crying. She was not going to cry in this hallway. But the thing about that kind of comment was that it didn't land in the professional part of you. It landed somewhere older, somewhere that didn't have the calluses yet, and the impact of it spread out like heat and took a minute to locate and contain. She contained it. Then she went inside and got back to work. What she could not have anticipated was the filing cabinet. Friday morning, she arrived to find her office unlocked, which it shouldn't have been because she'd locked it herself at 9:15 the previous evening. The cross-reference chart for the Corelli infrastructure contract, which she'd spent 4 days building and which she'd left in the top drawer of the filing cabinet, was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The drawer was open and empty, and there was nothing in the surrounding area that suggested it had simply fallen or been moved for a reasonable purpose. She stood in the middle of her office and thought, very carefully and very deliberately, about what her options were. She could report it. To whom? Petra, who was kind but had no real authority? Jeffrey Hale, who was almost certainly either responsible for it or delighted by it? Dante, who had chosen her and therefore had a stake in whether she could function, but who was also a man she had spoken to for a combined total of approximately 11 minutes, and whose particular brand of trust she had no real map for yet. She sat down. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She rebuilt the chart from memory, which took 3 hours and was made possible only by the fact that she had a habit, developed in the bakery years, of reviewing her own systems before she went to sleep at night so that the information stayed usable and not just stored. She didn't tell anyone about the missing chart, but she started keeping photographs. Elias Munro found her in the basement copy room on a Tuesday 3 weeks into her tenure at 7 in the morning, making copies of documents she'd already digitized because she'd learned by then that digital things had a way of disappearing in this building. He was 22, with the specific stillness of someone who had learned that being loud drew unwanted attention. He'd been assigned to support 3 different senior executives and was visibly drowning under the load, though he carried it with a kind of quiet determination that Imani recognized from a different angle, the look of someone who refused to let the waterline show on their face. "You're Imani," he said. "I am." "I'm Elias. I sent the coffee." He looked at the stack of documents she was copying. "What are those?" "Redundancy copies. Does anyone teach filing protocol to junior staff here?" He blinked. "No." "Do you want to learn it?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they expected to be a trick and is trying to find the catch. "Why would you teach me?" "Because you're smart and they're wasting you," she said simply. "And because I need someone on the second floor I can communicate with efficiently. We can help each other." He was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," he said. Which was, Imani noticed, the same word she'd used in the interview room. She wondered if it meant the same thing when he said it. Not agreement exactly, but the decision to step forward even when you couldn't see the full path, She thought it probably did. The gala invitation arrived on her desk on a Monday, printed on heavy cream stock with the company logo embossed in the corner. Valenti Global Annual Investor Reception. Required attendance for senior office staff. Priya materialized in her doorway 20 minutes later with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Did you get the invitation? I did. Are you going? It says required attendance. Priya sat down in the visitor chair that Imani had sourced from a storage room on the 11th floor and dragged upstairs herself 3 weeks ago. The investor gala it's a specific kind of event. The people there are very... She paused. They have a very specific idea of what this company looks like, what it's supposed to look like. I know what you're saying, Priya. I just want you to be prepared. I'm always prepared. Imani pulled her notebook out. I've already confirmed the catering vendor, the security rotation, the seating chart for the East dining room, and the translation services for the Zurich delegation. I reorganized the arrival sequence because the original plan had 2 competing investor groups in the same corridor, which is a territorial problem. Anyone who's ever managed a busy Saturday service would have spotted immediately. She looked up. I'm also going to need to find something to wear. Priya's expression shifted into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. I might know someone. The dress was emerald green, rented from a woman Priya knew who ran a boutique in the garment district that specialized in formal wear for events where you needed to look exactly as serious as you felt. It fit well across the shoulders and the waist, and when Imani stood in the mirror in Priya's apartment the evening before the gala, she allowed herself 15 seconds to simply look. She looked like herself. That was the only honest assessment she had. Not like a different version of herself, not like the person the building had been expecting when they hired a Valenti Global executive assistant. Like Imani Whitaker, 31, a black woman with a body that took up space in the way bodies are supposed to take up space, wearing a green dress that cost less than any other dress in the room would tomorrow night, standing in borrowed light. 15 seconds. Then she turned away and went over her event checklist. The ballroom was on the 32nd floor, and the view from it was the kind of view that existed specifically to remind people that they were above certain things. The city spread out below in that particular winter-clear way, lights sharp and hard against a sky that had gone deep blue at the edges. Imani arrived early. She always arrived early. She walked the room before the guests appeared, confirmed the positioning of every staff member, checked the catering stations, spoke briefly with the security lead about the revised entry sequence, and stood for a moment at the window looking at the city below with the calm of someone who has a great deal to do and is conserving herself for the doing of it. The guests arrived, and the room filled, and the specific physics of these events took hold. The slow gravitational pull of wealth and influence, the orbits of introduction and implication, the way certain conversations happened in certain corners for reasons that had nothing to do with the furniture. Imani moved through it efficiently and mostly invisibly, which was the ideal state. She coordinated the Zurich delegation's introductions. She resolved a seating conflict in the West dining room without anyone outside of 3 people ever knowing there had been a conflict. She intercepted a miscommunication between the catering staff and the event coordinator that would have resulted in the wrong wine at the wrong table for the wrong investor. She was crossing the room with a revised seating confirmation in her hand when she felt the cold hit her back. Not cold, wet. Red wine, the specific temperature of something that has been sitting at room temperature, spreading across the back of her dress in a wide arc. She stopped walking. Behind her a voice said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," in a tone that contained no sorrow whatsoever. She turned slowly. The woman holding the now mostly empty wine glass was beautiful in a specific architectural way, constructed for events like this one. She was a fashion executive whose name Imani had seen on the guest list. She was looking at Imani with an expression that was performing concern and not managing it well. The nearest guests had gone quiet. Not all of them. The room was large and loud, and most of it continued without interruption. But the immediate radius had that particular stillness of people deciding whether to acknowledge what they had just watched happen. Imani said nothing. She looked down at her dress. She looked at the woman. She breathed through her nose. Then she turned and walked toward the event coordinator's station because she still had a seating confirmation to deliver, and the wine on her back was cold and spreading, and there was nothing she could do about that in the next 60 seconds. And the seating confirmation was something she could do something about right now. She didn't make it to the station. She didn't make it because a man's voice crossed the room in a way that voices almost never manage in a room that large. Not by volume, but by something else. By the specific quality of a voice that rooms have learned to listen to before understanding why. What exactly, Dante said, is the rationale for hiring a woman who damages our public image? The man who'd said it, old money, investor, the kind of man who had opinions about everything and suffered no consequences for having them, was standing 3 feet away and had been speaking to another guest, not to Dante. But Dante was close enough to have heard, and apparently had, because he was looking at the man now with an expression that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. The man recalibrated quickly. I only meant that image management is, she rebuilt your entire arrival sequence tonight, Dante said. She identified a conflict between your group and the Bremer delegation that would have created a problem serious enough to require lawyers tomorrow morning. She resolved it before you sat down. He paused. If you'd like, I can arrange for you to sit at her desk Monday morning and demonstrate that you can outperform her. I'll clear my schedule to watch. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one in the interview room. That one had been shock. This one had the texture of something more complicated. The specific quiet of a room full of powerful people recalibrating their position relative to someone they had underestimated. No one spoke. No one accepted. Across the room, Imani stood with the seating confirmation in her hand and the wine cooling against her spine and something moving through her chest that she could not immediately name. Something that wasn't relief and wasn't gratitude and wasn't the performance of either. It was something rawer than that. It was the specific experience of being defended not with kindness, but with evidence, and finding, for the first time in a very long time, that the difference between those two things mattered more than she had realized. She turned and walked to the coordinator's station and delivered the confirmation and kept working. Later, much later, when the guests had thinned and the staff was beginning the quiet process of restoration, she found herself standing near the window again with a glass of water she didn't remember picking up. The city was the same below. The same lights, the same distances, the same cold clarity. Dante appeared beside her, not close, but within the register of a quiet conversation. The dress is ruined, he said. It was rented. I'll replace it. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He was looking at the city. His voice was even in the way that suggested evenness was a thing he had worked at, rather than arrived at naturally. Silas told me tonight that the Bremer delegation issue was a known risk in the original plan. Someone had already flagged it. Then why wasn't it resolved? That, Dante said, is what I'd like to know. He left without ceremony. Imani stood at the window and turned the information over in her mind the way you'd turn a stone to see what lived underneath it. Someone had left a known problem in the plan deliberately. Someone who had access to the scheduling system, who would have had reason to want the evening to go badly, or at least badly enough to create friction between Dante and the investors he needed. She thought about the missing chart, about the 3 dead phone lines, about Jeffrey Hale's expression when she'd asked about the date stamps on the Marseille documentation. She'd been reading the situation as hostility. Normal, interpersonal, territorial hostility from people who didn't want her in their building. Standing at the window, with the remnants of someone else's wine still damp against her back, she began to wonder if it was something with a longer reach than that and a more specific target than her. She opened her notebook. In the margin of the event page, in small careful letters, she wrote a single question. Who benefits if tonight fails? She stared at it for a long moment. Then she circled it, closed the notebook, and carried the question home with her into the dark. The question she'd written in the margin kept her awake for 3 nights. Not because she didn't have an answer, because she was beginning to, and the shape of it scared her more than not knowing had. She started the way she'd always started when something didn't add up. She went back to the paperwork. Not the dramatic paperwork, not the files that announced themselves as important. The quiet paperwork. The amendment addendums. The supplementary approval sheets. The pages that existed at the back of contracts the way the last paragraph of a long letter exists. Technically part of the document, practically invisible to anyone moving fast. She'd been moving through Dante's transition files for 2 weeks by then, cross-referencing documentation for the infrastructure merger that was meant to be the cornerstone of Valenti Global's legitimate future. 4 shipping companies. 3 port management agreements. An infrastructure development contract covering 2 eastern seaboard facilities. On paper, it was the architecture of a clean company. The kind of structure that didn't look like anything except what it claimed to be. It was a Sunday morning, early enough that the building had the particular quiet of a place that doesn't know it's being watched. Imani had badged in at 6:40, made coffee in the 14th floor break room using the machine that only worked if you held the filter basket at a slight angle, and sat down with the merger files and the specific kind of patience she'd developed at the bakery during the months when she was still learning that some problems revealed themselves only to people willing to sit still long enough. She found the first irregularity at 8:17. It was a signature on page 41 of the Harmon Port Agreement. Victor Harmon's signature, or what was meant to look like it. She'd seen his actual signature twice before in the file, once on the initial letter of intent from 14 months ago, once on the preliminary term sheet from 8 months later. Signatures change over time, she knew that, but they change in ways that follow the logic of habit. They compress under fatigue, they expand when someone is trying to make an impression. They don't rearrange themselves. The loop on the H in this version didn't close the same way. The terminal stroke on the last letter moved in the wrong direction. She set the page down, picked it up again, looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled the term sheet from the back of the file and held both pages up at the same angle and looked at them the way she used to look at 2 receipts when the numbers on the register didn't match at the end of the day, which was a specific kind of looking that required you to stop interpreting and simply see. The signatures had not been made by the same hand. She set both pages down carefully on the desk, as if sudden movement might change what they said. Her first thought was that she was wrong. Her second thought was that she was not wrong, and that she needed to be very certain before she did anything at all with this information. Her third thought arrived with the slow, cold quality of something that has been true for a while before the mind catches up to it. If someone had forged Victor Harmon's signature on a port management agreement, they hadn't done it once. You didn't forge one signature on a document this complex and call it done. You built a structure. You touched multiple pages. You made the forgery functional, which meant you made it systematic. She spent the next 4 hours going through every page of every contract in the merger file. By noon, she had found 7 separate instances across 4 documents. Forged signatures. Altered ownership percentages, small alterations. The kind that wouldn't register to someone reading for content rather than precision. A shift of 2 percentage points here, 3 there, adding up across the structure to a transfer of controlling interest that would not be visible in any single document but was undeniable in aggregate. Approval pages that didn't match the binding dates on the covers, which meant they'd been substituted after the legal review had already cleared the originals. She sat back in her chair and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Someone was stealing Valenti Global from the inside. Not stealing money, stealing the company itself. The legitimate company. The one Dante had spent 3 years trying to build toward. The one that was supposed to be the thing that outlasted everything else. The inheritance that didn't require violence to maintain. She thought about Dante at the window the night of the gala. Who flagged the Bremer issue and why wasn't it resolved? The way he'd said it without inflection, which she'd understood by then to be the way he spoke when he was angrier than he was going to let show. She thought about the question in her margin. Who benefits if tonight fails? And then, with the specific unpleasantness of a puzzle that has finally arranged itself into a picture you didn't want to see, she thought about Silas Kettering. She'd met Silas 4 times in her first 6 weeks. He was 71, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in rooms that didn't belong to him. He was Dante's oldest advisor, had served Dante's father before that, and carried his institutional knowledge the way certain people carry age, not as weight but as authority, as the thing that gave him the right to speak last and be listened to first. He had been courteous to Imani in the particular way that revealed nothing. He held doors. He used her name correctly. He asked once how she was settling in, and listened to her answer with the attentive stillness of someone who was not actually listening but was very good at appearing to. She had filed him under neutral in the internal ledger she kept of the people in this building. Not hostile, not an ally, a fixture. The kind of person who had been present so long that the organization had shaped itself around him. the way a tree shapes itself around a fence post, until it was impossible to say which one was holding the other up. Looking at the forged contracts now, she thought about what it would take to do this. Access. Sustained access, over months. Knowledge of the legal review process deep enough to know exactly where the substituted pages would pass without scrutiny. Relationships with the contract administrators. The kind of long history with the organization that made your presence in the relevant offices unremarkable. She thought about all of that and felt the specific coldness of a conclusion she did not want to reach. She took photographs of every altered page with her phone. 14 images. She uploaded them to a personal cloud account she'd created specifically for documents she didn't trust to the company network, using the cellular data on her phone rather than the building's Wi-Fi because she had started, over the past few weeks, to be careful about things she had not previously needed to be careful about. Then she printed one clean copy of her cross-reference chart, the one that mapped every irregularity against the relevant page numbers, document dates, and legal review timestamps, and folded it into her notebook. She was going to need to tell Dante. The question was how to do it without the information being intercepted first. She requested a direct meeting through the internal calendar system at noon on Monday and received no confirmation by 3 o'clock, which was unusual because Petra managed Dante's calendar with a precision that typically produced responses within the hour. She sent a follow-up to Petra directly, through the internal messaging system, and received an automated reply indicating Petra was out of office for a family emergency. She called the executive floor directly. The assistant covering Petra's duties told her that Mr. Valenti's schedule was fully committed through Wednesday and asked if she'd like to book for Thursday. She said Thursday would be fine. She went back to her office and sat with her hands folded on the desk and thought about the gap between now and Thursday and what 4 days represented in the life of a document fraud that was close enough to completion to already be irreversible. She decided Thursday was not acceptable. She walked up to the executive floor herself, which she had never done without an invitation, and which she understood as she stepped off the elevator was likely to be read as exactly the kind of overreach she'd been careful to avoid for 6 weeks. The covering assistant, young, anxious in the specific way of someone new to a position with consequences, looked up at her with an expression that was already composing a polite refusal. "I need 5 minutes with Mr. Valenti," Imani said. "Not Thursday. Today." "His schedule is—" "I understand his schedule. I need 5 minutes." "Miss Whitaker, I really can't—" The office door opened. Dante was on the phone, his jacket off, his expression carrying the contained tension of a man in the middle of something complicated. He looked at Imani with a question in his eyes that was not hostile, but was very direct. She held up her notebook. One hand. A small motion that was not dramatic but was clear. Something moved across his face. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and stepped back from the door. She laid the cross-reference chart on his desk and stood beside it while he read. She didn't explain as he read because she'd learned in 6 weeks that he did not like to be talked through things he could process himself. She'd simply organize the information in the order a person needed to encounter it. The first forgery, the pattern it established, the aggregate picture that emerged when you mapped all 7 instances against the ownership structure. He read for 7 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, his face was the one she'd seen at the gala, the contained one, the one where the thing he was feeling had gone somewhere internal that she didn't have access to yet. "You're certain," he said. "I verified each signature against 2 earlier samples from the same signatory. The substituted approval pages have print dates that post-date the legal sign-off. The ownership shifts are consistent across all 4 documents in a way that would need to be deliberate to achieve accidentally." She paused. "Yes, I'm certain." He looked at the chart again. "Who knows you found this?" "No one." "Where are the originals?" "In the merger files on the 14th floor. I photographed them. The photos are on a private account, not the company network." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not the company network?" She held his gaze. "Because I don't know who has access to what on this network, and because I don't know whose name I'm going to find at the end of this, and I wasn't going to assume my information was safe until I did." He stood very still. Outside his window, the city was doing its midday thing. Indifferent, continuous, occupying no position on any of this. "Leave the chart," he said. "Take everything else back with you. Don't discuss this with anyone." "Dante." She used his first name, which she had not done before in this office, and felt the small register of it in the room. The merger closes in 11 days. I know when the merger closes. If those contracts are filed with the forged pages, I know what happens if they're filed. His voice was flat and final in a way that was not anger directed at her, but was something that needed to go somewhere, and she was the available surface. He caught it and pulled it back. I know. I'll handle it. She nodded once, picked up her notebook, walked to the door. Imani. She stopped. You could have sat on this until Thursday. She turned enough to look at him over her shoulder. I could have. She left. The next 36 hours were the specific kind of quiet that functions as pressure. She went through her regular work. She processed Dante's correspondence. She ran the Wednesday morning logistics briefing in Petra's continued absence, managing 4 departments' scheduling conflicts with the same systems she'd spent 6 weeks building from scratch. She brought breakfast to the overnight staff, which had become less a gesture and more simply a part of the building's Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The maintenance workers and drivers and security staff who had started, almost without commenting on it, to expect her and to make space for her at the corner table near the loading dock where the light was better. She did all of this, and she kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman managing a busy week, which was true, technically, even if it wasn't the whole picture. On Wednesday evening at 6:50, she was in the underground parking garage, walking toward the elevator to retrieve a contract binder she'd left in her car that morning when she heard footsteps behind her that were not moving at the pace of someone going to their car. She turned around. There were 2 of them, neither of whom she recognized, wearing the specific blank-faced efficiency of men who had been hired for a task rather than a purpose. One of them was between her and the elevator. The other was covering the stairwell exit. She thought very clearly and without panic that she had perhaps 12 seconds to do something other than what was about to happen. And then she thought, with the slightly slower clarity of someone whose body is running on adrenaline while the brain catches up, that there was nowhere in this garage that 12 seconds got her. The one near the elevator said, Ms. Whitaker. Mr. Kettering would like a word. She did not run. Running would have used energy she needed to think with. She stood very still and looked at the man and said, Where? The waterfront warehouse smelled like salt water and machine oil and the specific cold of a building that had been closed for long enough to forget it was supposed to be warm. They'd taken her phone in the car. Politely, the man beside her extending his hand with the expression of someone performing a routine. She'd given it to him without resistance because resistance in a moving vehicle on a highway had exactly one outcome. Silas was already there when they brought her in. He was standing at a table near the center of the space with the measured ease of someone who had been waiting long enough to have moved past impatience into something more settled. A work light hung above the table, industrial, the kind that made everything it illuminated look slightly more real than it wanted to be. On the table was a stack of documents. Imani recognized the paper stock before she was close enough to read the text. She stopped walking when she'd closed half the distance between them. Close enough for conversation, far enough to keep her own geography. Silas looked at her for a moment. I'd like to start by saying that I have no interest in this being unpleasant, he said. Then let me leave. That's not quite what I mean. He gestured toward the documents. I'm told you're very thorough, that whatever you find you document completely and with considerable precision. He said this with the tone of a compliment, which made it worse somehow than if he'd said it as a threat. I'd like you to look at these. She didn't move. I can see from here what they are. Then you know what I'm asking. You want me to certify forged contracts. I want you to complete the certification process on the merger documents, which are not forged, they are revised. The distinction matters legally. The signatures are not from the people they're attributed to. The intent of the agreements has not changed. The ownership structure has changed by 14% in aggregate, Silas said. He said it the way you'd finish a sentence for someone who is taking too long. Yes, I know. You're very precise. He moved around the table and stood a few feet in front of her. He was not a large man, and he was not, in this moment, performing menace. I was performing something closer to sadness, which was somehow more unsettling. What Dante is building is going to destroy what his father spent 40 years constructing, not by accident, by design. He genuinely believes that what comes next should look different from what came before. He paused. He's wrong, and I've spent 2 years trying to tell him that in ways he'll actually hear, and I have failed. So I've made other arrangements. You're selling his company to the people who want to take it from him. I'm ensuring continuity. His voice did not waver. The people who made this organization what it is deserve to see it survive. Dante's version won't. Imani looked at him for a long moment. Silas Kettering, who had served this organization for 40 years, who had sat at Dante's father's table and at Dante's table and had apparently decided at some point that the second table was the one he was going to help someone else pull out from under the man sitting at it. She thought about Curtis Webb, about the handshake, about 14 months. What do I get? She said. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. Your debts are cleared, all of them, and there's enough for the bakery. A real space, not a starting over space. Something permanent. The number he said was real enough to hear twice, real enough to feel the weight of, standing in a cold warehouse with the smell of the water coming in through gaps in the walls. She looked at the documents on the table, at the registration numbers on the cover sheets, at the signature lines waiting at the bottom of the amendment pages. She thought about the honey table, about the mint green awning, about Curtis. And if I don't, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. I think you're a practical woman, he said. I think you've survived enough to understand that some situations resolve themselves better when people make the sensible choice early. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at the documents for a long time. Long enough that the silence in the warehouse became the kind of silence that has temperature. Then she said, "Give me a pen." She signed 3 pages before she found it. It was on the 4th Amendment sheet, near the bottom of the registration block, the corporate registration number for the primary holding entity. She'd memorized it 3 weeks ago, along with every other number in the merger structure, because memorizing numbers was a habit that cost nothing and had saved her twice at the bakery when the digital system went down. The number on the page was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. 1 digit transposed in the middle of a 12-digit sequence. The kind of error a tired paralegal might make on a long Friday afternoon and not catch because the surrounding text was correct and the eye went to the text. The kind of error that would invalidate the entire registration. She held the pen very still over the page. She was going to sign this line. Silas was watching from 6 feet away. The 2 men were at the edges of the room. She had no phone, no way to communicate, and no way out of this building that didn't go through at least one of the 3 people in it. She thought about Dante finding the forged contracts. She thought about 11 days and what happened at the end of them if these documents were filed with her certification attached. She thought about the wrong number on the page in front of her. And then she did the thing she'd learned to do in the worst months after the bakery. She made herself very small and very quiet inside. And she looked at what she actually had instead of what she didn't have. And she made a decision from that place rather than from the fear. She signed the line, the number she signed above. The one in the confirmation block where the certifying officer was required to transcribe the registration number for verification purposes was the correct number, not the one on the page, the one in her memory, the one that did not match what Silas's people had typed, and whose mismatch would flag as a discrepancy in any title search, any regulatory filing, any competent legal review that happened to look at the certification block alongside the registration block on the same page. A small error. Her hand was steady when she made it. She did not look up. She signed the remaining pages and set down the pen and straightened up and looked at Silas. He picked up the documents and checked them with the focused attention of a man who knew what he was looking for, which was her signature on the right lines in the right places. He was not looking for a transposed number in a confirmation block. Nobody looked for that. Good, he said. And then, with what appeared to be genuine relief, this didn't have to be difficult. I know, Imani said. Her voice was entirely level. Her heart was hitting her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the warehouse. And somewhere in the middle of her chest, a door had just closed that she understood, with absolute clarity, was not going to open again. She had just made herself the only person alive who knew that those contracts were both fraudulent and uncertifiable, in a warehouse with no phone and 3 people between her and the river, and the man across the table from her did not know it yet. She held very still and waited for what came next. Silas set the documents into a leather case with the careful movements of a man who had been waiting a long time to close something and was savoring the closing of it. Imani watched his hands. She watched them the way she'd learned to watch things that mattered. Not staring, not performing calm, just the steady peripheral attention of someone who has trained herself to track multiple things simultaneously without broadcasting that she's doing it. His hands were steady. His face had the specific relaxation of a man who believed the difficult part was behind him. She needed him to keep believing that for as long as possible. "You'll be taken back to your car," Silas said. He didn't look up from the case. "The funds will clear by end of business Friday. You'll receive confirmation through a third-party account. Nothing that connects to this evening." He snapped the case shut. "I'd suggest you don't share your impressions of tonight with anyone at the company, not for your sake specifically, just as a practical matter." "I understand practical matters," Imani said. He looked at her then, with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, something between respect and the particular satisfaction of a man who had found the right tool for a difficult job. "I believe you do," he said. "You're very good at what you do. That's not nothing." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was the same temperature as the room. One of the men gestured toward the side door, the one they'd brought her through, which opened onto a service road running along the water. The car was out there. She could see the edge of it through the gap where the door didn't quite meet the frame. She walked toward it. She counted her steps because counting kept her breathing even, and her breathing even kept her face still, and her face still was the only thing between her and the understanding that she was walking out of this warehouse carrying information that made her dangerous, and dangerous people in Silas Kettering's world had a specific lifespan that was not particularly long. 8 steps to the door. The man behind her. The second man still at the far wall with the position of someone maintaining coverage rather than escort. She pushed through the door into the cold. The drive back was 23 minutes. She knew because she counted those too. Not seconds, but the spaces between streetlights, the intervals of highway and exit ramp, the specific sequence of turns that told her they were coming back into Lower Manhattan from the west side. Her phone was still with the man in the front seat. She could see the edge of it in his jacket pocket. She was let out 2 blocks from the parking garage. The man handed her phone back without comment. She took it without comment. The car pulled away. She stood on the sidewalk in the dark, and the cold with the phone in her hand, and for approximately 4 seconds she did nothing at all, which was the duration of the gap between the thing that had just happened and her body's catching up to it. Then she started moving. She needed to reach Dante, and she needed to reach him before Silas did anything that assumed the contracts were finalized and operative, which meant she had a window that was currently open and would not stay open because Silas was methodical, and the next step in a methodical plan followed immediately from the completion of the previous one. She called Dante's direct line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called the executive floor. The night line picked up. A security desk, not an assistant. The man who answered told her that Mr. Valenti was not available and asked if she'd like to leave a message. She said no and ended the call. She was walking fast now, not running, because running on a Manhattan sidewalk at night drew attention, and she needed to think, and she could not think and run simultaneously the way she could think and walk. The temperature had dropped since the evening, and the air was the kind of sharp that went into your lungs and stayed there. And her hands were cold because her coat was still in her car in the parking garage 2 blocks behind her, and she was not going back for it. She tried Petra. The out-of-office message was still active, which meant Petra's family emergency was ongoing or someone had extended it, and Imani filed the small irregularity of the timing in the back of her mind where irregular things went. She tried Roman Calder. Roman was the head of security. She'd met him 4 times, and their interactions had been functional and brief. The particular professional shorthand of 2 people who both understood logistics and didn't need to establish that understanding repeatedly. She didn't have his direct number. She had the security department's main line, which she'd entered into her phone during her first week, because she'd learned at the bakery that knowing how to reach security at 2 in the morning was the kind of preparation that felt paranoid until it wasn't. He answered on the second ring. "Calder. It's Imani Whitaker. I need to reach Dante, tonight, in the next hour." A pause. Not long, but present. "What's the situation?" "I need to tell him directly. Can you reach him?" "Ms. Whitaker." "Roman." She stopped walking and stood still on the sidewalk because she needed him to hear the difference between a routine request and this. "I have been out of this building against my will for the past 3 hours. I need to reach him. Can you do that or not?" The silence this time was different. She heard him shift position. "Where are you?" She told him the cross street. Don't move, he said. Roman's car arrived in 11 minutes, which told her several things about where he'd been and how fast he'd moved, and the combination of those two pieces of information settled something in her chest that had been wound tight since the warehouse. He got out of the passenger side, which meant someone else was driving, which meant he'd already started treating this as something that required a second set of hands. He was a big man, not in the performed way, not the way people who want to be noticed about their size move through space, but with the settled solidity of someone who had decided a long time ago that size was functional and not decorative. His face, in the streetlight, was reading the situation faster than he was going to say anything about it. He looked at her. She was coatless in 34-degree air, and her dress was the one she'd worn to work that morning, and she was 2 blocks from a parking garage at 11:15 at night, with the specific stillness of someone who has been through something and has not yet had time to feel it. "Get in the car," he said. She got in the car. He was on the phone before the door closed, and she heard him say, "Found her," and then lower his voice for the rest of it. She sat in the back seat and put her hands between her thighs because they were cold enough to be painful now, and focused on the physical sensation because it was concrete, and concrete things were useful when the other things were very large. "He's been looking for you since 9:15, Roman said, turning in the front seat to look at her. "You missed the strategy meeting." "I know." He canceled the Singapore negotiation. She looked at him. The Singapore deal was worth, she knew exactly what it was worth because she'd managed the scheduling around it for 3 weeks. He canceled it. Called it off 2 hours ago, said something was wrong. Roman's expression was not warm exactly, but it was not nothing either. He doesn't cancel things. "I know," she said. "You want to tell me where you've been?" "I'll tell Dante." He nodded once and turned back around and the car moved. Dante was at the building. Not in his office, in the security operations room on the 2nd floor, which she'd been in twice before, and which had the specific tension of a space that had been occupied for hours by people who were waiting for something they didn't want to keep waiting for. He was standing at the surveillance panel when Roman brought her in, and he turned the moment the door opened, and the look on his face in the 3 seconds before he arranged it back into something controlled was the first time she'd seen him lose the arrangement entirely. "You're okay," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the kind of statement that happens when the body has been answering the opposite question for several hours, and the answer has just changed. "I'm okay." She came into the room and stopped a few feet from him and looked at him directly. "Silas has the merger contracts." The room went very still. There were 3 other people in it, Roman and 2 security staff she recognized by face but not name, and she felt all of them go still the same way. "Tell me," Dante said. She told him. All of it, in sequence, without editorializing. The warehouse, Silas's offer, the documents, what she'd signed, and more importantly, what she'd written in the certification block, the specific discrepancy she'd created and where it was on the page and why it would invalidate the registration filing. She watched his face as she talked. His expression didn't change externally, but his eyes moved through something. Recognition, then calculation, then something colder and more specific that she didn't have a name for, but that made the air in the room feel different. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Show me the page," he said. "The registration block." "I don't have the document." He has the document. "What number did you write?" She told him, both numbers, the one on the page and the one she'd written in the confirmation block. He turned to one of the security staff and said a name and a number, and the man was on the phone immediately, and she heard him relaying the registration numbers to someone on the other end who was apparently in a position to verify them against the actual corporate registry. Roman had moved to the door, and she could hear him on his own phone now, his voice low and directional in the way it got when he was in motion toward something. Dante turned back to her. "How many people know you were taken?" "You, Roman, whoever Roman called." "Did Silas say anything about the timeline when the contracts are being filed?" "He said the funds would clear by Friday. The filing would follow immediately. That's my inference, not his words, but the merger closes in." She calculated 9 days now. He needs the certified contracts registered before the closing window. Which means tomorrow or the day after. Dante looked at Roman. "The Harmon Port facility." Roman nodded. "Silas has access to the notarial registration desk through his contact at the Port Authority. If he's moving tomorrow, he's moving tonight." Dante's voice was flat. He's certified tonight. He's not going to sit on it. The room shifted into motion. Roman was already through the door. The two security staff were at the communication panel. Dante turned back to Imani one more time, and his expression had the specific quality of a man who has something to say that he's going to say very briefly because there is no time for it to be long. "You could have just signed what he wanted," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because the last person who handed me paperwork and told me to trust the process stole everything I had." She paused. "I wasn't going to let that happen to someone else." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Stay in this room. Roman will—" "I'm not staying in this room. Imani, you need someone who can identify the discrepancy on the document when you find it. In the dark, under pressure, in less than 30 seconds. She held his gaze. "I'm the only person in this building who knows exactly which digit on which line is wrong and why. So I'm not staying in this room." He looked at her for 3 seconds, long enough for the argument to be real and then to be finished. "Stay behind Roman," he said. You do what Roman says. If I say get down, you get down immediately. No question, no discussion." "Understood." "I mean it." "So do I." They moved in 2 vehicles, which Imani understood was a tactical decision rather than a matter of capacity. The Harmonport Notarial Registration Office was a 40-minute drive under normal circumstances, and they were going to make it in less, which she understood from the way Roman's driver handled the on-ramp. She sat between Roman and a security officer named Tess, who had the compressed readiness of someone who had done this kind of thing before and didn't need to perform composure about it. Dante was in the vehicle ahead. She could see its taillights through the windshield, and she kept her eyes on them the way she'd kept her eyes on the seating chart at the gala, as an anchor, as a point of reference in a situation where everything else was moving. "The registration desk closes at midnight," Roman said, not to her specifically, but into the car. "It's 11:40. Silas was leaving the warehouse at 11. He had the documents with him." She did the math. "He could be there already." "He could." Roman was on his radio, clipped and technical, coordinates and positions she partially understood and partially didn't. "We have someone at the building. They're watching the entrance." "And if he went in through the port access?" Roman looked at her. "You know the Harmon building?" "I reviewed the Port Authority's security protocols when I was scheduling the infrastructure site visits. There's a secondary entrance on the water side that uses a different credentialing system, one that predates the current security overhaul. It's technically still active." Roman was on the radio again before she'd finished the sentence. The car was doing 70 on the West Side Highway, the water dark and wide to their left, the city pulling backward behind them. Imani's hands were in her lap. She had stopped counting things because there was nothing left to count. All the preparation had happened, all the systems had been built, all the information had been communicated, and what was left was the part she had no system for. She breathed, in through the nose, out slowly. The car smelled like winter air and something synthetic, the particular smell of industrial-grade seat material in a vehicle that spent its life in motion. Tess glanced at her once. "You doing okay?" "Ask me in 40 minutes, Imani said. Something that was almost a smile crossed Tess's face. "Fair." The Harmonport building was a low concrete structure at the edge of the facility, functional in the way of things that have never needed to be anything else. The lights in the registration office were still on, visible from the access road, a yellow rectangle on the ground floor that said someone was inside. Roman's vehicle stopped 20 meters back from the main entrance. Dante's was already there, Dante out of it and moving, and she could see from the angle of his shoulders the specific quality of a man who is holding himself to a controlled pace because the alternative is worse. Roman was out of the car, and she was out behind him before anyone said anything about it. The night air was brutal on her bare arms. She registered it and moved through it. Roman got to Dante and they exchanged something low and fast, and then Dante looked back and saw her, and the look was not surprise. He'd known she'd get out of the car. But it was something. "Waterside entrance," Roman said. "Team is on it. Main entrance is us." "How many in there?" "Thermal says 3. Dante looked at Imani. "The discrepancy." "The confirmation block." "What page?" "Amendment sheet 4. Registration block, second line. The correct number is 7 in the 6th position. The document has a 1. He repeated it back to her exactly. She nodded. Stay at the door, he said. Roman's team goes in first. When it's clear, you come in and find that page. She wanted to argue that she should go in with the first wave because she was the fastest way to the relevant document, and every second it was in Silas's hands was a second closer to it disappearing. She thought about arguing it. She decided that this was not the moment to be right about something that wasn't worth the cost of the argument. Okay, she said. Roman moved. The two security officers with them moved. Dante moved last, and the door to the registration building opened from the inside. Someone on Roman's team had already reached it through the water access, and the four of them went through. She stood at the entrance. The night behind her was cold and quiet in the specific way of industrial spaces near water, the lap of it somewhere beyond the facility perimeter, a distant sound that had nothing to do with anything happening inside this building. She could see her own breath. Inside she heard voices, not shouting, the particular compressed intensity of a confrontation that hasn't broken into volume yet, the kind that runs on something more pressurized than noise. She heard Silas's voice. She couldn't make out the words. She heard Dante's, and couldn't make those out either, but the tone of it did something to the air in the doorway that she felt in her sternum. She took one step inside. The registration office was a single room with a counter along one wall and a clerk's desk behind it that currently had no clerk because the clerk had apparently been removed from the situation by the two security officers flanking the far door. The work light was on above the main table, the same quality of industrial light as the warehouse, the kind that made everything look like a document waiting to be signed. Silas was standing at the table. The leather case was open in front of him. 3 of the amendment sheets were laid out, and a woman she didn't recognize. Late 50s, Port Authority credentials on a lanyard, the expression of someone who very much did not want to be present for whatever this was standing beside the table with a registration stamp in her hand and the frozen posture of someone who has stopped emotion mid-completion. Dante was 6 feet from Silas. Roman was at the far door. Tess was behind Silas at an angle that covered the exit. Nobody was moving. Silas looked at the door, at Imani. His expression went through several things very quickly, and the last one that settled was not fear exactly, and not anger exactly, but the specific look of a man who has just understood that the variable he didn't account for was standing in the doorway in a dress without a coat, and had apparently been the variable all along. Imani, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had in the warehouse. I thought I'd been clear. You were very clear, she said. She looked at the documents on the table. Amendment Sheet 4, she said. Not to Silas, to Dante, who was already moving toward the table. Silas moved at the same moment. Not toward Dante, toward the table, toward the documents. And for a man of 71, he moved with a speed born of desperation, which is always faster than calculation, and his hand reached the stack of amendment sheets before Dante's did, and he swept them off the table and they scattered. 4 pages, 6 pages, separating in the air and landing in different parts of the room. The woman with the registration stamp pressed herself against the far wall. Roman moved. Tess moved. Silas turned, and there was a moment, very brief, the duration of a breath, where the room arranged itself into stillness around a central fact that everyone in it was simultaneously registering. Silas had 1 page in his hand. He was looking at it, and then he was looking at Imani, and his expression had arrived at something she hadn't seen on him before. Something stripped of the measured authority, something underneath it that was rawer and older and considerably less controlled. The confirmation block, he said, quietly. The way you say something when you've just understood that the thing you thought was done is not done and cannot be done in the way you intended. She met his eyes. Check the second line. He looked at the page. She watched him read the number. She watched his face. The leather case was still open on the table. Dante reached it first and gathered the scattered pages from the floor. 1, 2, he handed them to Roman without looking away from Silas. It won't file, Imani said. Not triumphant, simply factual, because the fact was what mattered, and the feeling could come later when there was somewhere to put it. The registration number in the confirmation block doesn't match the number on the document. Any title search will flag it as a discrepancy. Any regulatory filing will reject it. The entire certification is invalid. Silas stood with the page in his hand and said nothing. The room was very quiet. Outside, the water kept moving against the facility wall, indifferent and continuous, doing what water does regardless of what the people near it are deciding. Dante looked at Silas for a long moment. The look had the quality of something that had been building for longer than tonight. The specific accumulation of trust and time, and the specific violence of their undoing, arriving at an expression that was beyond anger, because anger has heat in it, and this had gone past heat into something colder and more permanent. 40 years, Dante said. His voice was very quiet. Silas didn't answer. You sat at my father's table. You sat at mine. Dante's jaw moved. You knew what this transition meant. You knew why I needed it to work. That's exactly why Silas started. Don't. Dante said it the way you close a door, firm, final, not loud. Don't. Roman had Silas's arm now, and the page and the port authority. Woman had been gently moved to a chair in the corner by Tess and was sitting in it with her registration stamp still in her hand because she apparently hadn't thought to put it down. Imani stood at the edge of the room, and her arms were very cold and her heart was doing something she was going to have to deal with later when the adrenaline finished burning through her system and left whatever was underneath it. Her hands were shaking slightly. She could see it, the faint tremor in her fingers, and she folded them together in front of her and pressed them still. Dante crossed the room toward her. He stopped close enough that she could see his face clearly in the work light, the contained exhaustion in it, the thing underneath the control that was not soft, but was real. He took his jacket off and held it out. She looked at it. You're freezing, he said. She took the jacket. It was warm in the specific way of warmth that comes from another person, and she pulled it around her shoulders, and the warmth went through her like something necessary. And she thought, standing in that registration office with Silas Kettering being guided out the door by Roman Calder, and the merger documents in ruins on the table, and the city outside cold and indifferent and continuous, that she was very tired and very awake at the same time, which was the particular combination that happened when you had been as afraid as she'd been for the past 4 hours, and the thing you were afraid of had not, in the end, won. She stood there in his jacket and let that word settle into her. Won. Not cleanly, not without cost. But the thing that was supposed to happen tonight had not happened, and the person who had made it not happen was standing in a registration office in Lower Manhattan with borrowed warmth around her shoulders, and shaking hands she was pressing together to keep still. That was going to have to be enough for tonight. The next several hours had the quality of aftermath. Not the dramatic kind, but the functional, exhausting kind that no one writes about because it doesn't look like anything except paperwork and cold coffee, and people moving through fluorescent-lit rooms doing the work of closing something that had been violently opened. Roman coordinated the handoff to authorities with the efficiency of a man who had managed complex situations in the early hours of the morning before and had learned that the key was to never let the complexity become visible in your face. 2 investigators arrived within 40 minutes, the kind whose credentials were federal and whose expressions were the professional version of completely unreadable. They took custody of the documents, the leather case, and Silas Kettering, who went with them in a silence that was not the silence of a man who had run out of things to say, but of a man who had decided, very deliberately, that the time for saying things had passed. He didn't look at Dante when they walked him out. Dante watched him go. His face had the stillness of a man who has put something in a room and closed the door on it and is not yet ready to decide what to do with the room. Imani watched Dante watch Silas, and she understood without needing it explained that what was happening in that moment was not just the arrest of a conspirator, but the ending of something much longer, 40 years of institutional history, walking out a door in the custody of federal investigators, and the ending of it was not clean regardless of how necessary it was. The Port Authority woman, her name was Darlene, Imani learned later, 22 years at the registration desk, was interviewed for 40 minutes and released. She'd been approached by Silas 3 weeks earlier with the specific credentials and procedural language of a man who understood bureaucracy well enough to make an illegal request sound like an administrative accommodation. She had not understood fully what she was being asked to facilitate. This was, the investigators noted, a distinction that mattered. By 3 in the morning, the registration office was empty of everyone except the investigators and their equipment and the particular residue of a night that had almost gone very differently. Imani sat in Roman's car in the parking area outside with Dante's jacket still around her shoulders and her notebook open in her lap, not because she was writing anything, but because having something to hold made the waiting easier. Roman opened the passenger door and got in. Investigators want a full statement from you tomorrow morning, he said. 10 o'clock. I'll send you the address. Okay? They're going to ask about the warehouse, all of it. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You doing all right? She considered the question with the genuine attention it deserved rather than the reflexive, I'm fine, that was the easier answer. I'm cold, she said, and my hands are still shaking a little, and I'm going to be very tired in about 2 hours when everything finishes burning off. She paused. But I'm okay. Roman nodded. Okay, he said, as if this were a sufficient and complete accounting, which she appreciated. Dante got in the back seat beside her 3 minutes later. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked out the window at the building, and then he looked at his hands, and then he looked at her. The merger can still close, he said. The legitimate contracts, the originals that went through legal review, those are intact. The forged versions are in federal custody. We file the originals, we close on schedule, the transition continues. And the internal structure? We rebuild it. His voice was tired in a way she hadn't heard before. Not the controlled containment of a man managing his own exhaustion, but actual tiredness, the kind that gets through when the containment has been sustaining too much for too long. It's going to take time. There are people in that organization who knew what Silas was doing and said nothing because they agreed with him, and people who didn't know and are going to feel the ground shift under them when they understand how close it came. He exhaled. I have to find out which is which. I can help with that, she said. He looked at her. You've done enough for one night. I've done enough for one, she agreed. Tomorrow's a different conversation. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. The investigators were thorough and not unkind. The session the next morning lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes and covered everything. The initial document review, the photographs, the attempt to reach Dante, the warehouse, the specifics of what she'd signed and what she'd written in the confirmation block and why. The lead investigator, a woman named Cressida Bowman, who had the specific patience of someone who had sat across from a great many people in a great many difficult situations and was not going to rush any of them, asked her questions in an order that suggested she already understood the shape of the thing and was checking her map against Imani's version of the territory. At one point, Cressida set down her pen and looked at her directly. You understood when you wrote the incorrect number that there was a possibility Mr. Kettering's people would identify the discrepancy before you got out of the building. Yes. And you did it anyway. Yes. What was your reasoning? Imani thought about how to answer this honestly without making it sound like something it wasn't. Not bravery, not strategy, in the calculated sense. I didn't have anything else, she said. I couldn't fight my way out. I couldn't run, I couldn't call anyone. The only thing I had was information and one pen and the knowledge that a wrong number in a confirmation block is small enough that an anxious person checking signatures isn't going to catch it. She paused. It wasn't heroic. It was the only option that had any chance of working. Cressida looked at her for a moment. In my experience, she said, and then seemed to decide that the sentence didn't need a second half, and picked up her pen and continued. The investigation moved quickly by the standards of these things, which Imani understood was partly the nature of the evidence. Meticulous, photographed, cross-referenced in a system she'd built specifically because she'd learned 2 years earlier that documentation was the only form of protection that couldn't be stolen while you were sleeping, and partly the fact that Silas Kettering's network extended in directions that other agencies had been mapping from different angles for a considerable period of time and were glad to have a pressure point that accelerated their own work. 3 executives were identified and removed from Valenti Global within the first 2 weeks. A financial partner whose name Imani had seen on the merger documents twice and noted without context now had context. A security officer on the 3rd floor who had, it emerged, been responsible for the missing cross-reference chart in her first month, the dead phone lines, and several other frictions she had attributed to routine hostility, and which had in fact been deliberate obstruction. Jeffrey Hale was not among the conspirators, which surprised her slightly. He'd been territorial and obstructive and had designed the Marseille assignment as a trap, and all of that had been personal and professional rather than criminal. He received a formal review and a revised set of responsibilities and the specific humiliation of being told by the new chief executive of the legitimate division that his department would now report to her office directly. The new chief executive of the legitimate division was Imani Whitaker, which was announced in an internal communication on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the night at the registration office, and which produced a quality of silence across the 14th floor that was different from every other silence she'd experienced in that building. Not hostile, not shocked in the way that contained contempt, but simply the specific quiet of an institutional fact landing in a space that was going to have to reconfigure itself around it. Priya appeared in her doorway 40 minutes after the announcement. "I need you to know," Priya said, "that I have been quietly telling people you were going to end up running this division since approximately your third week." "I know," Imani said. "You know?" "You're not as subtle as you think you are." She looked up from her desk. "I'd like you to move to the executive floor. Communications director, if you want it." Priya stood very still for a moment. "I want it," she said. Her voice was even, but her eyes were doing something she was trying not to let be visible, and Imani looked back at her files to give her the privacy of it. Elias Munro became the head of the administrative department on a Thursday, which was the day Imani realized she'd done the thing she'd intended without quite noticing the moment it had happened. Built a person up until they were taller than the space that had been given to them. She'd watched him run his first full department briefing from the back of the room. He'd been nervous at the start, the specific visible nervousness of someone whose anxiety lives in their hands and who has learned to manage it, but hasn't entirely stopped feeling it. By the third agenda item, he'd found his pace, and by the end, he was running the room with the particular authority of someone who knows the material better than anyone else present, and has simply decided to let that be enough. After, she caught him in the hallway. "How do you think it went?" she asked. He considered this with the honesty she'd come to expect from him. "Better than I thought it would. Worse than it'll go next time." "That's exactly right," she said. He almost smiled. Then he did smile, and it was the real kind, the kind that hadn't been practiced for the occasion. "Thank you," he said, "for, the filing protocols and everything after. You did the work. You showed me what the work looked like." She looked at him for a moment. 22 years old, shoulders considerably less folded inward than they'd been 4 months ago, running a department that hadn't known what to do with him when he arrived. "You're going to be very good at this," she said. He nodded. The nod had weight in it. She went back to her office and sat for a moment in the chair that no longer wobbled because she'd fixed the leg herself in her second week, and looked at the window that still faced the interior shaft, but now had a small succulent on the sill that Priya had brought her without explanation one morning, and felt the particular satisfaction of something built that was actually holding weight. The Whitaker Opportunity Program was not named by her. That was Dante's doing, which she'd objected to on the grounds that naming a program after yourself was the kind of thing that attracted the wrong kind of attention and the wrong kind of candidates. And he told her that naming it after the person who designed it was the accurate thing to do, and accuracy was the policy of the new Valenti Global, which ended the argument. The program evaluated candidates without photographs, without family connections, without the names of schools that functioned as social passwords. The initial pilot processed 47 applications. 11 people were hired across 6 departments. 3 of them, within the first 6 months, were identified as exceptional by their department heads and recommended for accelerated development. She reviewed each of those 11 files personally, not because the system required it, but because she needed to know the system was doing what it was designed to do, finding the people who had been present all along in rooms that hadn't looked at them correctly. The first file she reviewed was a 44-year-old logistics coordinator from the Bronx who'd been managing a family-owned moving company for 16 years and had never had a resume that translated his work into corporate language. He'd applied because his daughter had sent him the listing. He'd almost not applied because the listing was for a position at a company whose building he'd walked past for 20 years without imagining it was somewhere for him. Imani read his file twice. Then she approved it and wrote one note in the margin. "Strong instinct for systems. Put him somewhere those matter." She set the file down and thought about the day she'd walked into 300 applicants in a snow-dusted navy suit with a repaired seam and a handwritten notebook, and how the room had felt and what it had taken to stay in it. She hoped the building felt different now to the people walking into it. She intended to spend a considerable amount of time making sure it did. The conversation with her family happened on a Sunday afternoon in March, which was Imani's doing rather than theirs. She'd thought about whether to have it at all and had decided, over the course of several weeks, that the question wasn't whether to have it, but whether to have it on her terms or on the terms the situation would eventually produce by itself, and her own terms were preferable. Her mother arrived first, then Aunt Rochelle, then 3 cousins who'd driven up from New Jersey and brought food because bringing food was the family's language for, "We know this is going to be uncomfortable and we're trying." They sat in Imani's apartment, her new apartment, not borrowed space, a place she'd signed for herself on a Tuesday afternoon, and had stood in for 20 minutes before unpacking anything, simply to feel the specific fact of a space that was hers, and drank the coffee her mother made because her mother made coffee the minute she entered any kitchen that wasn't already running, and talked around the subject for a while in the way her family talked around subjects. Her mother was the one who finally said it. "I should have told those people to leave you alone, after the bakery, when they were saying things." She was looking at the window rather than at Imani. "I didn't know how. I was scared for you and I showed it wrong and I let it come out as—" She stopped. "I let it come out wrong." Imani looked at her mother. At the specific angle of her shoulders, which she had inherited, and which she now understood were the architecture of a woman who had been holding things up quietly for a very long time and had never quite figured out how to ask for help with the weight of them. "I know," Imani said. "I know you were scared. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but I understand it." Her mother looked at her then. The look had something in it that had been building for a long time, and had apparently decided this was its moment. "You're not going to tell me it's fine," she said. It wasn't a question. "It wasn't fine," Imani said. "It's also not something I'm going to carry into whatever comes next. Those are 2 separate things." The room was quiet for a moment. Rochelle said, from the corner where she'd been sitting with both hands around a mug in the same position she'd sat the night she'd told Imani the room was spoken for, "The bakery. Are you really opening another one?" "Yes." "Next to the headquarters building." "Next to the headquarters building." Rochelle looked at her for a long moment. "That's either very brave or very extra," she said. "It's both," said Imani. And she meant it. The new bakery didn't have a name for the first 2 weeks after it opened. This was intentional. She'd wanted to see what it felt like from the inside before she decided what to call it. What the space said about itself when it was doing what it was supposed to do, which was feed people and give them somewhere to sit and let them be warm for a little while, in whatever way warmth was useful on a given day. On the 3rd Thursday, she was standing behind the counter at 6:15 in the morning, watching the first customers come through. The maintenance crew from next door, the drivers from the early shift, Elias, who had apparently started his mornings 45 minutes earlier than necessary in order to get here before the line formed. And she looked at the space and the people in it, and the chalkboard menu she'd written by hand the night before, and she thought, the honey table. Not a resurrection. The original was gone, and what had happened to it had been real, and the loss of it had cost her things that couldn't be returned. But it was also a name that had belonged to her before someone else's choices took everything it was attached to, and she was not going to let him have the name too. She erased what she'd written as a placeholder and wrote the honey table in the same lettering she'd used on the original, and went back to making coffee. Priya noticed it at 7 when she came in. She stood in front of the chalkboard and looked at it, and then looked at Imani and didn't say anything, which was the right response. The anniversary event was Dante's idea and Imani's logistics, which was how most things work now between them. He had the vision and she had the operational architecture, and between the 2 of them things actually happened rather than simply being imagined and discussed. A year after the night at the registration office, Valenti Global occupied a position in the city that would have been unrecognizable 12 months earlier. The criminal network inherited from Dante's father had been systematically dismantled in cooperation with federal authorities, a process that had been painful and specific and had required Dante to make decisions about people he'd known his entire life that were not the kind of decisions that became easier because they were necessary. The legitimate operations, shipping, infrastructure, investment, were producing results that the previous structure, in all its decades of operation, had never managed to produce cleanly. The company now employed more people than it ever had. More of them were people who had not previously been considered for what they were actually capable of, because the person running the hiring program had strong opinions about that. The anniversary event was held in the same ballroom where the investor gala had happened. This was deliberate. Imani had been the one to suggest it, which had surprised several people who'd assumed she'd want a different venue, and she'd explained her reasoning to exactly nobody, because her reasoning was her own. She wanted the room to mean something different, She wore a green dress. Not the same one. That one had been dry cleaned and returned to the boutique and was probably on someone else's shoulders by now. This one she'd bought herself. The same color because the color had nothing to apologize for, fitted well across the shoulders, because she bought things that fit correctly now, rather than things that were close enough. She'd stood in the mirror at home and given herself the 15 seconds and then turned away and gotten her notebook. The employees filled the ballroom the way employees fill rooms when they actually want to be somewhere, not the performed presence of a corporate obligation, but the specific energy of people who feel some ownership over the occasion. The Whitaker program hires were there. Elias was there, standing with the particular straight-backed ease of someone who has grown into a space that used to feel too large. The maintenance crews, the drivers, the overnight security staff, the people who'd eaten breakfast at a corner table in the loading dock area and who had, over the course of a year, become the most reliably vocal advocates for what the company was trying to become, because they'd watched it change from the inside and knew exactly how much it had cost. Dante spoke. He was not a natural public speaker in the way that people who have been trained to perform public speaking are natural. He was something else, a man who said things because he meant them and trusted that meaning them was sufficient, which it turned out to be. He talked about the transition, about the cost of it, about the people who had made it possible, who were standing in this room and who he wanted to name specifically, which he did. Roman, who looked as if he'd rather be guarding a perimeter than receiving acknowledgement, but stood for it anyway. Priya, who accepted it with the composed expression of someone who had been waiting for institutional recognition for a considerable time and was not going to be undignified about finally receiving it. Elias, who went slightly red and looked at his shoes briefly, and then looked up because he decided not to look at his shoes. Then Dante paused. The room had the particular quality of a moment that knows it is a moment, a collective held breath without being organized as one. There is one person, he said, without whom none of what you're standing in would exist. He didn't look at notes. He'd written nothing down for this part. Not because she's exceptional in some abstract sense, because she sat in a broken office on the 14th floor and rebuilt a system that had been made intentionally difficult and brought breakfast to people who had been invisible for years, and found a fraud that would have destroyed everything this company was trying to become, and stood in a warehouse alone with nothing except a pen and the knowledge that one wrong number in the right place was the only move left. He stopped. His voice had the quality of something that was being said exactly once and needed no amplification. She did all of that without being asked to, without being thanked, without any particular assurance that it was going to matter. The room was very still. I want to thank her now, he said, in front of everyone who benefited from what she did, which is everyone in this room. He looked at Imani, who was standing near the window, the same window she'd stood at a year ago with wine on her back and a question in her notebook margin. And his expression had the specific quality of a man who has worked very hard for a very long time not to let certain things be visible, and has decided that tonight is not the night to continue that particular effort. She is the bravest person I have ever known, and the most capable, and she is my equal in every way that actually matters. He stepped down from the small platform. The room watched him cross toward her. He stopped in front of her, and the room went completely, absolutely still, the kind of still that happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand that they are present for something that is not a performance. He reached into his jacket pocket. He did not kneel, which she had specifically told him 3 weeks earlier when they'd discussed how this evening might go, that she did not want. He stood in front of her the way he'd stood in front of her in the interview room a year ago, directly, without theater, as if the direct thing was always the only option worth considering. He held out the ring, and he said, simply, "You're the only person in my life who has never needed me to be anything other than what I actually am. I would like to spend the rest of my life in the vicinity of that." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She was aware of the room around her, Priya's expression, which had arrived at something luminous and was making no effort to contain it. Elias's face, which was doing something complicated in the best possible direction. The particular weight of a room full of people who wanted something good to happen and were watching it happen. She looked back at Dante. "That is a very unusual proposal," she said. "Yes. You couldn't have done this privately? You said no kneel and no private. That was actually your requirement." She had in fact said both of those things. "I know," she said. She held out her hand. The wedding was small in the way of things that prioritize meaning over scale. The employees who'd stood beside them during the transformation were there. Roman, who wore his first suit of the year without visible complaint. Priya, who cried during the vows and made absolutely no attempt to hide it, and was therefore the most honest person in the room. Elias, who had organized the logistics of the reception on his own initiative without being asked, doing it with the quiet competence that had become his natural register, and who received the specific private satisfaction of watching a system work correctly because he had built it correctly. Imani's mother was there. She held Imani's hand for a moment before the ceremony started, in the particular way of a woman who has more to say than there is time for and has accepted that, and Imani held her hand back, and that was enough. Rochelle was there too, in a purple dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and worn with the certainty of a woman who had never once made a clothing choice she wasn't prepared to defend. Imani wore cream, not white, which was her preference for reasons that were entirely her own. She walked herself. This was also her preference, and when the small ensemble began and she came through the doors of the reception hall into the space full of people she had chosen and who had chosen her, she felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of a moment that was not about surviving anything, not about proving anything, not about rebuilding from the wreckage of something else. It was simply what it was, her life, as she had made it, with the people in it who had seen her clearly, moving forward into whatever came next with eyes open and hands steady. She walked toward Dante, who was watching her come with the expression of a man who has spent decades being feared and has found, late and unexpectedly, something better to feel instead. She reached him. He took her hand. His grip was the same as it always was, present, solid, not performing anything. "Okay," she said. His mouth moved. Not a full smile, not yet, but the approach of one. "Okay," he agreed. Outside, the city was doing its continuous, indifferent thing, traffic and wind, and the particular cold, bright quality of a winter morning that doesn't care what is happening inside any of its buildings. The honey table next door had been open since 6 a.m. The morning crew had left a small note on the counter for her. "Congratulations from the early shift. We saved you a Danish." It was, she thought, walking forward with her hand in his, an entirely sufficient thing to come home to. The woman who had walked out of her aunt's building in the snow with one suitcase and a repaired seam and no plan. Except Forward had not arrived at a place where the hard things were finished. She was not naive enough to believe in that place. But she had arrived at something real, a company she had helped save, a program that was finding the people rooms had been failing to see, a building full of people who had been fed and considered and given systems that worked, a man who had said "my equal" in front of everyone and meant it with the specific solemnity of someone who does not say things he does not mean, and a bakery with a mint green awning and a handwritten chalkboard menu and a name that had belonged to her before and belonged to her still, which was its own kind of evidence that some things, when they are truly yours, cannot be taken permanently, only interrupted, delayed, made to wait in the dark until the person who built them is ready to build them again. She was ready. She had been ready, she suspected, for a long time. She had simply been waiting for the rooms to catch up.